Thank you very much, Tom, and thanks for the kind introduction. So today what I want to talk a little bit about is Napoleon's soldiers. I've called it the soldiers that made the empire, but it's really about the men of Napoleon's Grande Armée. So over a 15-year period from the coup of Brumaire in 1799 to the 100 Days in 1815, over 2.5 million men served in some capacity in Napoleon's army. Some men had served the revolution, some would volunteer into the French army, and a few were incorporated when various parts of Europe were conquered or annexed, but the vast majority of these men were conscripts. They were the ordinary soldiers that made up Napoleon's army, and who made the great victories of Austerlitz, Jena, Friedland, and so on possible. They were the men who marched on the fatal route to Moscow in 1812, who rebuilt the army in 1813, only to be sacrificed again on the altar of the emperor's ambitions. And they were the men who marched in 1815 to their apparent appointment with destiny on the bloody field of Waterloo. They were, quite literally, the soldiers who made the empire. Now, these soldiers of Napoleon were drawn from across all 130 departments of the French Empire. This ultimately included annexed lands in Belgium, the Rhineland, Italy, Switzerland, Spain, and the Netherlands. The Illyrian departments or provinces alone were not required to send men directly to the French army, instead providing regiments for the army of Italy. Now, most of these conscripts were young men in their early 20s, late teens perhaps, who represented a fair cross-section of French society. It would be a bit facile of me to claim that these men are somehow forgotten in the Napoleonic Wars, but compared to operational histories or biographies of great generals, studies of the French rank-and-file soldier have remained relatively rare. What I'd like to talk about today is the French soldier and his career in Napoleon's Great Army. I'm basing a lot of this talk on research I've been doing over the past couple of years into the regimental enrollment registers of the French Army, which give brief biographical information and short career histories of pretty much every man in the force. So in some ways, this is a work of prosopography. I'm trying to build up a picture of the career of the French soldier through examining a mass of collective characteristics. If all goes to plan in today's talk, I'll share some information on soldiers' origins, their promotions, their experiences of battle, their wounds, and how they ultimately left service. I also want to make a few suggestions about how the composition of regiments changed as bloody campaigns and new rounds of conscription began to make their mark. So I'd like to start, though, by giving a brief overview of the process of conscription, which is one of the most constantly evoked but only murkily understood aspects of the Napoleonic army. Conscription was introduced into France in 1798 with the Loi Jourdain, and while there had been call-ups before, the 1793 Levée en Masse, for example, they don't really count as conscription properly understood. I'm happy to address that in the questions if anyone wants. So 1798, the system really comes in. And although the system would evolve over the years of Napoleon's rule, it is essentially the system of 1798 that remains the basis of conscription through the period. So the fundamental basis of conscription is that all men in France were imagined as liable for military service, but it was never intended that everyone should actually serve. Instead, every year a certain number of men would be called up to replenish the army, ensuring it didn't run short of manpower and ensuring that France's defence was entrusted to a cross-section of its citizens. All young men in France were therefore grouped into annual classes by age, with the classes of men aged from 20 to 25 liable for conscription. Although both law and in practice, in fact, call-ups each year were to be made on the first class of 20-year-olds, and only if more manpower was needed would the classes of 21 to 25-year-olds be called up. So very much it's meant to be the 20-year-olds who are called up each year. Once a man reached the age of 26, he was no longer liable for service. And that may seem a bit unusual to us in the context of the universal call-ups of the World Wars, for example, but at no point in the Napoleonic Wars was every eligible man called up, and at no point did France issue compulsory call-ups to men over the age of 25. The only flexibility in this regard was that due to the ongoing war, conscripts were not discharged at the age of 26, as legislation demanded should happen in peacetime, and that from 1806, classes were called up months early, meaning that eventually conscripts were aged 18 or 19 rather than 20. Now, to call men up, the central government decided how many men would be summoned for the active army and for the reserve, and decided on the timing of the call-up. Each round of conscription should theoretically have been approved by the legislature, But in practice, Napoleon started pushing through conscription legislation as a senatus consultum, so pushing it through the Senate to avoid debate while giving it a veneer of legislative approval. So once a call-up was approved by the Senate, the Ministry of War would assign each department within the empire a quota of men it was expected to fill. When orders arrived from Paris, each department would summon the men of the eligible class to assemble at the chosen time. And men were gathered by canton, which is an administrative unit of about 10 to 20,000 people that groups together a number of communes, and there were several cantons in each department. So the young men would assemble at the chief town of their canton, and they would draw lots for service. For the first 5 years or so, cantons could actually select conscripts in other ways, but eventually the drawing of lots, which was conducted from an opaque bowl in full public view so nobody could cheat, that was settled on as the fairest way to choose conscripts and was made obligatory. Now, theoretically, all men had an equal chance of being drawn for service, as this was by lot, but naturally there were exemptions. The most common reason, which affected around a third of men overall, was a medical exemption, which was granted for infirmity, chronic ill health, or lack of height. The minimum height that a young man had to reach was initially set at 159.8 centimeters, which is around 5'3". But in 1804, it was reduced to 154.4 centimeters, or about 5'1". In 1811, though, with the ever-increasing need for manpower and with conscripts being called up at an ever younger age, which kind of meant they hadn't actually reached full maturity in height, men measuring over 148.8 centimeters, so about 4'10", 4'11", were given only temporary discharges, so they had to be brought back after a year to see if they'd grown. So the tightening of regulations and the loosening of health standards by medical officers did bring exemptions down towards the end of the empire, but still over the course of this kind of 15 years of conscription, about a third of Frenchmen avoided conscription for medical reasons. Many others gained exemptions for family reasons. Sole providers for a widow or for an orphan sibling or for a father aged 71 or older could claim effective exemptions, as could anyone with a brother already in service or who had been killed or wounded in the army. Married men could also claim exemptions, but only if their class had already been through one round of conscription, which is something that was not always fully understood at the time and has been largely misunderstood since. Other ways out of service included reserved occupations such as arms manufacture, already being in the military, so being an officer exempted you from conscription, being a student at the Imperial University, being a clergyman or seminary student, winning grand prizes for art or science, or of course acquiring a replacement or a substitute. Now, this might seem quite wide-ranging, but most of these exemptions were realistically only open to the wealthy or the very well-connected, with replacements especially strictly controlled and expensive. So these exemptions probably took out about half of the potentially eligible men, which meant the chances of those who remained being selected for service were quite high, and they increased as the empire went on. Now, once selected for service, men were sent home for a week or two until the paperwork was all completed. Then they were summoned again to report to their departmental capital, gathered into groups, and escorted off to their assigned regiments. Now, of course, there are myriad complexities of the conscription system that I don't have time to go into now, but that was its essence. Men were balloted at the age of 20, and a certain proportion were called up for service. That proportion grew over time, and classes were also called up ever earlier, even before the debacle of Russia and the major losses of the peninsula. So, for example, the legislation summoning the class of 1810 was passed in September of 1808, when many of these men were still only 18 years old. From 1809, we also see classes aged 21 to 25 routinely revisited for more manpower. Now, naturally, there were some men who didn't like the idea of military service and did all they could to avoid it. Some resorted to fraud, some even to self-mutilation, and some ran for the hills, hiding out and living a life of brigandage. Many more simply stayed at home, though, or found a sympathetic farmer somewhere to take them in. The state's response of using gendarmes to round up obvious draft dodgers, and later putting garrisons in the home of refractory conscripts until they surrendered, and finally sending mobile columns through the departments to sweep up all men of conscription age who could not prove an exemption, in the end proved generally effective in reducing open conscription resistance by 1812. But for all that conscription resistance has often grabbed headlines and scholarship on the topic, it's the men who were conscripted who are the focus of today's talk, and many of them did actually show enthusiasm for the emperor's armies. Now, these men, these conscripts, were from all walks of life. As you might imagine, most of them really came from the labouring classes. It's long been recognised that a heavier burden fell on rural areas than urban areas, if only because urban areas were more likely to use rural migrants to fill their quotas and were more likely to have higher proportions of educated young men in reserved occupations. Now, there's still some work to be done on the social background of conscripts, but I've compiled here, and hopefully you can see it there, from a sample of around 2,000 men across 5 infantry regiments, an idea of how many men came from each walk of life. So from this table and from these men, you can probably see that around half are working in jobs on the land or in directly related roles. Now, simply because of their age, we're unlikely to find conscripts who were master craftsmen. We're unlikely to find many bourgeois jobs, such as proprietors, lawyers, doctors, and so on. But there are a number of clerks, merchants, shopkeepers, hoteliers, a few landlords, some former students, and even one coroner on the list. Most of them don't make this list, though, because this is only professions with 12 or more men that I came across. Civilian expertise was certainly valued in the army, and men skilled in metalwork, carpentry, saddlery, caring for animals, or in boating was supposed to be placed in relevant engineering, transport, or artillery train units, while men from literate professions, whatever arm they were in, were more likely to find themselves promoted and given ranks or positions where their literacy or skill with numbers could be used. So such then is the human material that makes up the contingents of drafted men. Now, once assembled for conscription, these draftees were marched or in fact simply walked in groups from their department to their destined depot, escorted by a small number of soldiers under either a junior officer or an NCO. The escort was never large enough to act as a guard, but it was meant to prevent desertion in the contingent and to arrange food, shelter, etc. on the march. Conscripts would usually arrive at their depot after several days, but sometimes a few weeks of walking. Correspondence from conscripts almost universally depicts this journey as unpleasant, although inevitably some of the misery and homesickness of the conscripts could be alleviated by being in the company of other men from the same village or the same canton. Now, upon arrival at their depot, conscripts were formally enrolled in their regiment, at which point they became a soldier rather than just a conscript. They were issued with uniforms and they were given an inspection. Inevitably, some men would have become ill on the march or would have proven unable to withstand the rigours of military life, and they would be put on light duties or admitted to the infirmary until a general officer could inspect them and decide whether to discharge. The majority of men, however, were quickly absorbed into their unit. They were assigned a company and a battalion, and in most cases would be assigned a camarade de lit, who would be a man with whom they shared a bed in the barracks. They would also be assigned a mess group of 6 men with whom they would eat. In larger contingents of conscripts, they might be fellow newcomers, but the intention was that they should be established soldiers, which would theoretically help these conscripts to bed into the unit. It would also help to build a sense of esprit de corps, which is so crucial to warfare in any age. Some conscripts really did take to this life quite well, but others suffered from poor conditions, poor food, sadistic or criminal comrades, or petty tyrants amongst officers and NCOs. Memoirs occasionally bring up the trope of soldiers fighting duels against the worst of the bullies in order to gain respite or win acceptance as one of the unit, and even if these stories are sometimes a bit exaggerated, I think they do hint at some of the difficulties and unpleasantness of the first days of service for many men. So as you might imagine, some conscripts, of course, simply decided to desert. Losses to desertion in Napoleon's army were far higher in depots than in active duty battalions, and they were a major drain on manpower. The scourge of desertion was well understood at the time, and the scale of it has been by no means been missed by historians since. But by going through these service histories that I've been looking at and looking at thousands of men through these regimental records, we can build up a picture of exactly when in their careers men deserted. And that's something that hasn't really been done in particular detail before. So in a case study of the 33rd line, for example, I've calculated that around 2% of the 5,000 conscripts who joined between 1803 and 1807 deserted in their first week of service. About 4%, or 1 man in every 25, deserts in the first month of service, and around 7.5% of all conscripts deserted within the first 6 months of service. And in this, I'm not even counting every man that runs off, because several absconded temporarily and later returned. This is just the men who left the regiment permanently through desertion. So given that just under 10% of men overall deserted, we can see that desertion was clearly skewed towards the first days and weeks of service. The exact numbers for this particular regiment are that 103 men deserted in the first week, 194 in the first month. Then the next 2 months see a total of 98 more desertions, and the 3 months after that, a total of 71 more. So you can see a fairly linear decline in desertions, with the first weeks being very much the worst. So 3/4 of desertions that would ever happen happened in the first 6 months, and just under half of them happen in the first month. Such high desertion rates, of course, were reduced over time. Depots did get better at preventing men from absconding, etc., but desertion at the start of men's service remained a huge problem. And the 33rd isn't exactly an outlier either. 25th Line, for example, lost 15% of its conscripts of 1808 to 9 to desertion at some point in their careers, and 2/3 of them were lost in the first few months of the men's service. So for a significant percentage of Napoleon's conscripts, probably in the high single figures, the experience of military service was a brief march to join their unit and then desertion. They didn't serve outside of their depot, let alone outside France, and they came nowhere near active combat or even active garrison duty. Now, a second major scourge of conscripts' first few weeks in the army was disease. Conscripts in an unfamiliar environment with a new diet, with comrades coming in from all over the country bringing different illnesses with them, and in conditions that weren't always the most sanitary, were much more susceptible to disease and illness. Losses from illness in general in Napoleon's army don't come as a surprise, as deaths from disease outnumbered those in combat in almost all standing armies up to the First World War. But again, crunching through the numbers across thousands of men in the regimental registers, it becomes clear that illness was actually generally worse with new conscripts. Sometimes disease would just lay men low for a few weeks and they'd return to service. But overall mortality from illness was much higher in the first year of service than at any other point. During their careers, 1 in 5 conscripts of 1798 to 1807 in the 33rd Line, for example, would die of illness. That's just over 1,000 men in total. 494 of them, so a tiny bit under half, died of illness in the first 12 months of service, in many cases after relatively long periods in hospital already. Now, disease was endemic among conscripts and was a persistent killer, but the losses in the regimental registers also tell us a story of outbreaks and minor epidemics in depots that could be especially deadly. So in June and July of 1804, for example, 44 men of the 33rd Regiment died from disease, compared to only 2 in the same period the previous year. So we're seeing some kind of minor epidemic coming through these figures. There's a similar minor outbreak in 1807 that again hits new conscripts hard. And once illness took hold in a camp, the cramped conditions, the ill-ventilated barracks, the shared latrines, communal eating, and the continual close contact between soldiers meant that it was exceptionally difficult to stop, whether this is a viral disease, bacterial disease, or one that's spread by lice. However it's spread, very difficult to stop. So as with desertion, disease costs Napoleon's army a reasonable percentage of its men before they had any chance to complete even their basic training. And in some cases, illness could literally decimate contingents of conscripts before they even began their service. So here's just one example. On the 24th of March 1809, a contingent of 140 conscripts from the Department of Loire arrived at their depot of the 70th Line in Brest. Less than 3 weeks later, on the 12th of April, one of their number died of fever in the town hospital. 3 days later, in the same hospital, he's followed by another comrade, then one on the 27th of April, 2 more on the 29th of April, one each on the 5th, 11th and 21st of May, one on the 9th of June, and one on the 20th of June, and another man in the same hospital on the 9th of August. 3 others in the same contingent died of fever in hospital in Napoleonville, which is now Pontivy, in the first weeks of service. So these 14 unfortunate young men, exactly 1/10 of this conscription of contingent of conscripts, died of fever long before they could contribute to Napoleon's military machine in any meaningful way. They were all only 18 or 19 years old. So from the regiments I've looked at, it seems safe to state that somewhere between 10 and 15%, and maybe in some cases up to 20% of conscripts, were permanently lost to the army in the first months of service through desertion or disease without getting anywhere near the enemy. And across the army, this would have added up to vast annual wastage. Most conscripts, however, did survive their first weeks of service and their training. I'll get on in a moment to how the service of conscripts affected the army, but I want to say something first about how these men progressed through the army, specifically with promotions. So NCOs, non-commissioned officers, were a crucial cog in the Napoleonic army. Even after the reforms of 1809 that reorganized battalion structures, each company required 8 corporals, a furrier, who is a quartermaster corporal, 4 sergeants, and a sergeant major. Other NCOs are needed for headquarters, depot duties, and recruitment. Now, promotion is still one of the issues that I'm playing with the stats, but I do have a few insights I'd like to share. So first of all, how many men actually got promoted during their careers? Well, again, looking at the 33rd, and this time with a snapshot of 2,300 men who were in the regiment in December 1805, we can see that 582 of them received promotion at some point in their career, which is about 25.3%. I should say that 35 of those men were also demoted at some point. 14 of them were promoted for a second time, 4 of them demoted for a second time, and 1 man had the dubious distinction of being promoted 3 times to corporal. I should say that the demotion could be for disciplinary reasons, but it also did happen when men moved between companies sometime. So I can't really make too much of an argument out of the demotions at this stage, sadly. But I can make something out of the promotions. So assessing promotions by year of recruitment. As you might expect, men with longer service were more likely to be promoted. Over half of the men who joined the army before conscription was introduced and were still there in 1805 received promotions. Of those who joined after 1798, it's closer to a third, but it drops to only 14% for 1804 and 9% for 1805. Now, I should emphasize that these stats don't represent all men recruited in those years, just men who were recruited, but still in the army in December 1805, so these percentages are of course a bit skewed. Now, it will shock nobody to hear that longer service means more likelihood of promotion, but promotions clearly aren't based purely on seniority, because there's some variation in these numbers. We know that the army prized literacy, reliability, and in a nebulous sense, leadership as well, but these things are pretty difficult, if not impossible, to trace. But we do have data on things like the geographical origins of soldiers, their health, or their profession, to try to start building a picture of why men were promoted. So I put together a sample of around 11,000 infantrymen from 10 different regiments to try to see if I could find some patterns. In total, in this sample, 23.5% of men gained promotion of some form at some point, which actually matches pretty well with the men of the 33rd with their 25.3%. So in all, we can say it's a pretty fair estimate that around a quarter of men received a promotion at some point in their careers. But if we're looking at influences on promotion, what about height? Well, from the sample of 11,000 men that I've done, there's a really interesting trend for higher ranks to see taller soldiers. Now, in private soldiers here, I've lumped together grenadiers, voltigeurs, and fusiliers, and have made no distinctions for the companies that these NCOs were in. So how do we explain this trend for men of higher rank to be taller? Well, honestly, off the top of my head, I have no firm answer, but there are a few potential suggestions. First of all, there is a statistical correlation between height and health in general in Napoleonic France, to the extent that departments with a shorter average height also had a higher percentage of men declared medically unfit for service. So are we therefore just seeing more rugged individuals, more robust individuals being promoted, and that being reflected in greater average height? Perhaps. Second, we know that literacy was prized, and again, more literate departments tended to have a taller average height. So are these heights therefore simply a symptom of a totally different phenomenon and not a criterion in themselves? Finally, I just showed a minute or two ago that the longer a man served, the more likely he was to be promoted. While using my 1814 to 15 sample, it turns out that the average height at enlistment actually diminished during the empire, as this graph shows, partly because of relaxing height and health requirements, partly because men were conscripted at a younger age. So is what we're seeing with the promotions simply a reflection of the difference in height and length of service? I probably need to crunch a few more numbers on all of this. I have no real firm answer yet, but I would actually suggest that all three factors are probably at play. Now, literacy is definitely something that we know was important for NCOs, as all sous-officiers theoretically had to be literate. Now, it probably was possible in practice to get to sergeant without being literate, but sergeant majors and furriers, they were definitely required to have a level of education, and certainly if you wanted to go on to higher rank beyond that. Now, individual literacy is almost impossible to trace from the records, but we can extrapolate a little from men's stated professions or their department of origin. Both are pretty blunt instruments, but it is worth a look. So, in comparing professions to promotion, there is a rough correlation between more skilled work and men gaining rank. So, among the handful of clerks, former students, surgeon's assistants, and so forth in my sample, which are too small to be on this list, sadly, promotion in them is well over 50%. As you can see from that list, though, the slightly more skilled jobs tend to have a higher rate of promotion, whereas things like servants, journeymen, ploughmen, they have lower promotion rates. So again, more work does need to be done on this, but I might suggest tentatively that some of the structures of civil society were to an extent re-established in the French army through promotion. Men of skilled professions were broadly held in higher esteem, while men in lower paid and less skilled professions tended to be less well regarded and less well rewarded. That's not to say that the army couldn't function as a vehicle for social mobility even at this lower level, as there are plenty of examples of journeymen or landless labourers moving up the ranks. To give just one example, Toussaint Claret from Musy in the Eure was a 19-year-old stable boy of slightly below average height when he was conscripted in April of 1807. He was made corporal on the 1st of May 1811, then sergeant on the 21st of March 1813. When he received his discharge on the 7th of September 1814, only a week after his 27th birthday, and having marched with the Grande Armée for 7 years, he had held positions of responsibility and would have been able to return home a much more respected figure. Now, this is not a full rags to riches dream or story, which was far beyond the majority of men. But the army clearly could offer these minor avenues for advancement and opportunity that were denied elsewhere, even if, on the whole, promotion went to men with greater literacy or in more skilled professions. It is worth looking at literacy again through the idea of departments of origin. Now, in their classic book, Reading and Writing, Furet and Usuf suggested that literacy rates in France around the time of the Revolution and Napoleon differed significantly by department. So using their literacy statistics, I've been able to compare a department's average literacy to how many men from that department actually got promoted according to my 11,000-man survey. To avoid outliers, I've excluded results where there's fewer than 20 men from the department. You probably won't be surprised to hear that departments with higher average literacy had more promotions. But just to be sure, given how important length of service was in my other samples, I did another calculation to calculate how many promotions would be expected based on length of service of each man in the department. I don't need to go through the tedious calculation now, but basically what we get is the result in the column highlighted. A negative number indicates that fewer than expected men were promoted based on the average length of service in that department, and a positive figure indicates more men were promoted based on the average length of service. And again, what you see here is a really strong correlation between average departmental literacy and expected promotion. Now, I've actually put together a map that shows where these departments are, which is the map on the left. The red colour on my map on the left is higher promotion than expected. The lighter yellowish colours are a bit above average. Light blue is slightly below expected, and dark blue strongly below the expected rates. And as you can see, there's actually quite an interesting geographical spread, with the north and east generally enjoying far more promotions than the centre and the south. And if we compare it to the map on the right, which unfortunately has the colours inverted from mine, with dark being high literacy and light being low, it's possible to see that there is a correlation here between, or a potential correlation between literacy and promotion. But there are other factors as well, military tradition and things that we could take into account. Now, of course, some of these conscripts went even further in their careers and made the jump from the ranks to the officers' mess. For this, I returned to my sample of soldiers from the 33rd line, which seems to have had more promotions than most, with what I think is quite a large 2.4% of conscripts, or nearly 1 man in 40, receiving an officer's commission. Now, these officer promotions were spread across men of all vintages, including volunteers, conscripts, and even one replacement conscript. In most of the records for this regiment, previous professions aren't listed, so sadly I can't say anything about that, but I have calculated the average length of service for each man before promotion to give some kind of perspective. So this is before their promotion into an officer's commission. So the shortest service before promotion to officer rank was only 381 days, so they moved through all of the NCO ranks in only a year. But only 4 of the 133 men who I found to have been promoted were promoted after less than 3 years' service. So we're not just seeing accelerated promotion handed out to an elite few who happen to have been conscripted. The average length of service before promotion is almost 12 years. And even if we exclude the long-serving veterans of the Revolutionary Wars, the average among post-1798 conscripts is just over 8 years. Most conscripts promoted from the ranks were commissioned from 1808 onwards, as losses in junior officers began to cause real problems for the active service battalions, and as the army was expanded with new regiments that needed new officers. A large tranche, of course, were also promoted in early 1813 to replace losses from the Russian campaign. The longest service in the ranks before promotion in this regiment actually went to a chap called Jean-Baptiste Carrière, who was promoted in November of 1813, so right at the end of the wars almost, and he'd been in service for 32 years by that point, having joined the army as a teenager in January of 1782. Now, I haven't actually traced the careers of these officers much further, but some clearly did continue to rise through the ranks. Robert Sebastian Gou from Verdun, for example, was promoted in 1804 to be an officer after 6 years in the ranks, and was subsequently raised to lieutenant and then to adjutant major in 1807, which is a role that usually led to a captaincy and was seen as a fast track to battalion command. Interestingly, there is a chef de bataillon de Gou listed in Martinian's list of officer casualties, and he's listed as being wounded at Borodino in 1812, twice again in 1813, and then being mortally wounded at the Battle of Namur on the 20th of June 1815, 2 days after Waterloo, in virtually the last clash of the Napoleonic Wars. I don't know if it's the same man, but I really do want to find out. Now, whether promoted or not, conscripts who avoided disease and did not succumb to the temptation of desertion were likely to face battle at some point, and that's what I'd like to touch on now. The forces that Napoleon took into battle clearly evolved over the years of the empire, and by 1813 were overwhelmingly composed of younger soldiers. But even in earlier campaigns, the composition of the army changed significantly. So again, using stats from the 33rd line, we can see that at the outbreak of the Napoleonic Wars, around 2/3 of men in the regiment were already conscripts, with the rest being veterans of the Revolutionary Wars and a handful of volunteers. But by the beginning of the Ulm campaign in 1805, the proportion of conscripts had grown to 76%, and by the opening of the Jena-Auerstedt campaign, which is in October of 1806, it was 80%. Losses and new conscripts meant that there was not much of an increase in the average experience of the regiment, though, in this period, as you can see. In September 1805, we see an average of 4 years and 2 months service, but 13 months later, October 1806, this had only grown to 4 years and 4 months. But the huge losses in the Eylau campaign of 1807 and the large influx of conscripts early in 1807 as well really changed things. At the opening of the Friedland campaign in June of 1807, some 86% of the regiment's registered soldiers are conscripts, and the average length of service has plummeted to only 3 years and 3 months. Now, there were Still 250 veterans of the 1790s in the regiment at this point, but that is more than balanced out by the fact that we have 1,100 men, or just over a third of the regiment's manpower at this point, who had been in the army for a year or less. Just over half of the regiment's men, when the Friedland campaign began, had joined since the victory of Ulm only 20 months earlier. So the upshot of this is that we should perhaps be a little more cautious when we talk about the veteran regiments of the Grande Armée. The officers at company and field officer level certainly enjoyed some experience, and the NCOs were mostly veterans of several campaigns at this point. But the rank and file of these regiments was in a constant state of renewal, with a high proportion of new soldiers even in the early part of the Napoleonic Wars, when Napoleon is still winning his great victories. Now, another issue that would affect men's battlefield performance would, of course, be the formation that they used. And through my research, I'm able to make a couple of suggestions about how the actual individuals in these formations shape battlefield appearance and even battlefield performance. Now, units through the wars would have adopted a wide range of open and close order formations that I don't have time to address fully, but I do want to say something about the average line of battle for a French infantry battalion. So according to regulations, a French infantry battalion would line up in 3 ranks, which were arranged by height. The tallest third of men would be in the front rank, the shortest third in the middle rank, and the intermediate third in the rear rank. Now, using records of height for every company in every battalion for a full division of infantry, which in this case is the 1st Division of the Waterloo campaign, I've done a few calculations about what this actually means in practice. So, across this entire division, the front ranks averaged 168 centimeters for each company, the second rank 154 centimeters, and the rear rank 161 centimeters, giving a differential of 14 centimeters between the first and second rank, and 7 between the second and third rank. As you can see here. Apologies, this is in centimeters, by the way. The French record in centimeters at the time. But the difference here is about 6 inches between the first and second rank, and about half of that between the second and third rank. Now, the height of the blue bar that you can see is the man's height, while the silhouettes include the headwear, which would sit about 9 centimeters above a man's head. This isn't a mock-up of any specific file, but it's simply an average of what a cross-section of a battalion would look like across the division. Of course, men didn't march into battle in such open order, though. Regulations demanded that they should be a third of a metre apart, and soldiers' memoirs at Waterloo, for example, confirmed that they were tightly packed, so they would have actually looked something more like this. So what does this mean for the experience of battle? Well, first of all, looking at that, you can see there are clear implications for what men in the second rank could actually see, and of course for them giving fire. So a man of average height in the front rank would stand at about 177 centimeters with his shako, so 5'10"-ish in his headwear. Calculating from average face sizes and dimensions, we can extrapolate that the average man in the second rank would have their eye line at about 144 centimeters from the ground. He would therefore be staring at a third of a meter's distance at the base of the neck or the top of the pack of the man in front of him. And in full ranks, it's even worse. With eyes front, the average soldier will be looking at a spot roughly there on the man in front, so at the base of the neck. At a distance of 40 centimeters, so a bit more than the regulation third of a meter, the average person's field of vision would be about 3 meters wide, with the central half actually focused and the outer half increasingly blurred and unfocused peripheral vision, as is represented here. Their eye line, or what they can easily see in front of them, is basically hitting the shoulders of the men in front, meaning that realistically very few men in the second rank will have seen anything of the target they're marching towards. If we also take into account up and down vision, which is about 25 centimeters above and below, with everything else kind of out of focus, you can see these men aren't seeing a huge amount of what's going on. Men in the third rank would, of course, been looking probably somewhere around the top couple of centimeters of the headwear of the men in front of them. And then beyond that, at the heads of the taller men in the front rank. So they too won't have seen a huge amount. So if we're discussing the experience of battle, we can calculate with a fair degree of certainty that 2/3 of men didn't see past the front of their own unit. probably has an impact on how they are going to experience this combat. But beyond the issue of visibility, the height differential also makes real problems for firing. So regulations specify that when giving fire, the front rank should kneel, the second rank should fire over their heads, and the third rank should shift their foot outwards 8 inches to give a clear shot in the gap between the shoulders of the men in the front 2 ranks. The problem with this, of course, is that it significantly stalls an attack, and once men are stationary and kneeling down, it's much harder to get them to stand up and go forward again. So for much of the Napoleonic Wars, French soldiers advanced and fired from a standing position. Now, there are regulations for standing firing, although it is not recommended, and this demands that units fire by rank, rear rank first, with men withdrawing their musket barrels very carefully before the rank in front moves to take aim. The intention is to give effective fire, but also to prevent unnecessary accidents. So the men in the third rank were directed still to shift slightly outwards to give themselves a position to fire, but the men in the second rank were told to remain in parade position. And there are a couple of things to note here. First of all, for the rear rank to fire, the formation essentially has to stop, which again negates the idea of going forward. So you're faced with a choice of either stop or lose the rear third of your firepower. But the real problem is for the middle rank. A man in the second rank was obviously going to be shorter than the man ahead of him. And even if the height difference was the smallest in any company I came across that whole division of only 9 to 10 centimeters, so about 4 inches, he would still have to raise his weapon at least 14 degrees above the level to shoot directly ahead. And at a distance of 40 meters, which is point-blank range essentially, that's still putting a bullet 10 meters above a target's head, 10 yards perhaps above a target's head. So there is, in short, no way that a man in the second rank can usefully contribute to a firefight to his direct front unless the person in front of him either kneels down or has fallen as a casualty. Now, the third rank would have been in a slightly better position to fire, but even they would have had to tweak their muskets up maybe 5 degrees, and that puts a shot about 3 yards above a target's head at 40 meters. Now, clearly, French officers would have been aware of these issues and would have found a way to mitigate them. But the question is how? Could we suggest, for example, that the French penchant for going in with a bayonet and eschewing lengthy musketry exchanges was more a function of necessity than from a culture of the army of audacity and bravery? Or should we be looking to find evidence that alternative formations were used in practice, which were much more useful for delivering musketry? I don't have full answers at this stage, but it is something that's definitely worth looking into, because following the regulations, these formations simply can't fire. But battle, of course, also leads to significant casualties, and that's what I'd like to shift my focus onto now briefly. Records on wounds in the registers I've been looking at are plentiful, but it's relatively rare that they really explain how the wound affected the soldier. Now, sometimes they do. The registers of the 69th Regiment, for example, give unusually detailed descriptions of these wounds. So to give just a couple of examples, in 1811, we find Corporal Bonaventure Giraud, who was discharged 10 months after being wounded by a bullet that entered above the right collarbone and came to rest below the central ridge of the shoulder blade, severely impeding movement. A year later, we see Fusilier Joseph Watteau, who's an agricultural labourer, who was pensioned due to a shot to the right metacarpal, which fractured 3 rear phalanges, occasioning the loss of 3 fingers and the atrophy of the whole hand. So occasionally we get this level of real detail that show how wounds become debilitating for soldiers, but unfortunately, these kind of details are rare enough that really quantifying this is difficult. For the most part, the wounds that are mentioned are only in kind of vague terms in the registers. Men who are forced out of service normally just have the fact of the wound mentioned. So, wounded at Friedland, pensioned. For those who were wounded and returned to the ranks, there is usually a bit more detail, which includes where the wound was received, how it was inflicted, roughly where on the body, etc. So, compiling information from the registers of men who kind of remained in the army after the wounds, we can see that a fair proportion of men were actually wounded at some point in their service. I've used for this records from two regiments, the 21st and the 85th, and I've used the 1815 versions of their registers because in 1814 and 15 all men were re-registered and all of their wounds recorded. So from here we can see that there's a sample of around 3,000 men in these two regiments, and around 350 of those men had received wounds. In total, 527 wounds between them. Extrapolated across the army, this would mean that somewhere over 10% of soldiers received wounds serious enough to be recorded in the official registers, but remained in service all the way up to 1815. And I found that really interesting. 10% of men with previous wounds that were quite severe. But admittedly, I don't quite have enough data to make that full extrapolation. But these records tell us something about the wounds, as you can see. Perhaps unsurprisingly, as these wounds were ones that didn't force men out of service, a large proportion of them come to the limbs. Almost half are leg wounds, and nearly 1 in 5 are arm wounds. Around 2/3 of these wounds are also gunshots, although grape shot and shell explosions account for around 10% of all wounds. Wounds to the head and the torso were disproportionately likely to be inflicted by cavalry as well, with sabre wounds to the head and lance wounds to the body. Bayonet wounds are actually a tiny proportion of all of these that I calculated. Now, while some men survived wounds, and all of the men that you can see in that table would have survived the wounds, others, of course, would not. And I'd like to end by giving a little information on how conscripts ultimately left service. And I've got 3 sample sets for this with different kind of sampling criteria to try to bring that out. The first set is a sample of 1,450 men from the 36th line, which is just over 10% of the regiment, and this covers all years of conscription with at least 100 men from each year. Second is a sample of 1,002 conscripts from the 25th line, all of them from 1808 and 1809, and the third sample is 5,610 men from the 33rd line, representing every single man who served in the regiment from 1803 to July 1807. And I'll be very brief in sharing each sample with you. So in the first sample from the 36th, I've got a breakdown of the fates of the men of each conscription cohort, but I thought it was best to just show you the kind of overall averages. So you can see the overall results here, and several interesting points should jump out. Only 3.3% of these men who passed through this regiment were still in a state to be employed in the 36th when it was reformed after Napoleon's abdication in 1814, which is a surprisingly low number, I'd say. This probably would go up by a few percent if some of the men sent on leave returned, or if some of the prisoners returned home, but it really isn't a high number of men coming through the wars totally unscathed. In this particular sample, almost 1 in 5 men died during service, but that probably will go up depending on how many of the men lost at Smolensk or Kulm, which were 2 big incidents that took men out of this regiment, were actually killed or died of wounds. The registers simply record them as presumed killed or prisoner of war. But the biggest single item on that list is died of illness. 15.9% of all conscripts dying of illness rather than on the battlefield. 1/4 of these men are officially recorded as being lost as prisoners, and another 1/4 lost to medical discharge. So in all, well over half of these men would have died or had their health severely damaged by their service. This is backed up by the sample from the 25th. As you can see on the main table, there are a lot of different ways that men left the army, but I've compressed them down into a couple of tables, with the table on the top right showing overall numbers. So again, 1 in 5 dies during service, although in this case, most of those 20% of men listed as missing probably also died because they were all lost in Russia. In this sample, there is, however, an inordinately large number of deserters or men that transferred to other units. The large number of deserters is probably because these are being recruited from Belgian departments for part of it. But the deserters and the transfers somewhat skew things. So if we exclude them, we get the table in the bottom right, where we can see that 30% of men who weren't transferred or deserted died in service. 12.8% get a medical discharge, and 29% missing. So overall, 72.4% of the men who entered service in this regiment and weren't transferred elsewhere are killed or disabled by service. So this is a massive loss for the regiment. And that broad picture is reconfirmed by the final sample I have, which, as I said, is of 5,610 men of the 33rd Line. And this consists of every man who passed through this regiment from March 1803 to July 1807. 645 of them had joined the army before conscription was introduced, but almost 5,000 of them are conscripts. So again, rather than giving a month-by-month breakdown of losses, I'm just going to give you the broad headlines. So once again, a quarter of men are dying in service. But really interesting in this sample, almost 1 in 5 die of disease. The number of deaths in this sample may also go up depending on how many of the 5% or so of men captured in Russia didn't make it home. Prisoners as a whole in this sample make up 15% of them, and another 30% of men receive medical discharges. Now, the 33rd, on which this sample is based, was one of the harder fighting regiments. They serve at Austerlitz, at Auerstedt, at Eylau, Friedland, Eckmühl, Aspen-Essling, Wagram, Borodino, Krasnov. It's a litany of Napoleon's battles, a whole host of actions. They also serve in 1815, and as such, the number of killed in action is rather higher than the other regiments. The bloodiest battles for this particular group of conscripts was Eylau, 89 men killed, then Wagram with 37, Borodino 29, Austerlitz 17, and Auerstedt 10. But even with these vicious battles, the major battles of the empire, we're seeing nearly 3 times as many men dying of disease as dying on the battlefield. Now, for these men of the 33rd, I've actually also calculated the average length of service of soldiers. If we include all men, we get a career average length of just over 5 years and a median of just under 4 years. But if we exclude the volunteers of the 1790s, many of whom had already had long careers before the Napoleonic Wars, and if we concentrate on conscripts from late 1798 onwards, the mean length of service, or the mean length of a military career for a man in Napoleon's army, was just around 3 years and 10 months. The median length of service is around 2 years, 9 months. So in simple terms, over half of Napoleon's soldiers left the army having done less than 3 years' service. Around a quarter of all men in his army didn't last through the first year. And this is based on a sample of conscripts from 1803 to 1807. This doesn't include the massive losses of 1812 and 1813 cohorts. So overall, between these samples then, what we really see is that between a fifth and a quarter of all conscripts died in service. Perhaps another quarter received medical discharges broken by their service. Around 20% went missing, presumed prisoner, but we don't really know their fates beyond the fact they didn't return to their particular regiment. This proportion would probably rise dramatically for later cohorts whose men all went to Russia. Perhaps 10% of men deserted, although as I showed earlier, the vast majority of those men deserted in the first few months. Only a small fraction of each cohort actually made it to the end of the wars, and even then, it seems that more than 1 in 10 of the veterans of 1815 had actually been wounded seriously enough for it to be noted on their service record. Now, we've known from qualitative accounts and narratives of Napoleonic veterans that the life of the soldier was one of hardship and suffering, punctuated by the most fleeting of glory. What I've tried to show here through this quantitative research is something of the reality of the darker side of service through the scale of things like desertion, losses from disease, which disproportionately affected men in the first months of their service. I've also shown where careers could be made, with a quarter of men receiving promotion, and some of them even going on to get commissions. I've suggested how the height of soldiers affected their battlefield experience and given a few statistics on how battles affected soldiers through losses and through wounds. Now, these might seem like somewhat cold statistics, and they by no means tell the full story, but I hope they have given you some flavour of what life and military service was like for Napoleon's men. Thank you.
And thank you, Graham. That's excellent. And I love that level of detail. I'll say again, I put my own comment in the chat. If people have questions, put them forward in there. We have one from Chris, so we'll get to in a moment. Graham, maybe you can stop sharing your slides, and that way people have a chance to better see us. There we go. And then I'm going to take the role of Chris here because I have a number of my own questions to get to too. So I'm wondering, was there a voluntary aspect to joining the Army? Was there recruiting elements, people going out there searching for recruits, or did they rely more heavily on conscription once that was brought into play?
Yeah, from 1798, it's almost entirely conscription. Volunteers were allowed, um, and they could actually volunteer into a specific unit, but there were no recruiting parties going around looking for volunteers because they simply didn't need to. They relied on conscripts and contingents of conscripts coming in. The only real exception is 1815, when Napoleon's trying to rebuild his army, doesn't want to reintroduce conscription. So he simply recalls all old soldiers, including the contingent of 1815 who'd been called up before. But because conscription's not coming in there, regiments do start to cast around for volunteers a bit more. Um, but there's no real sense that people are trying to gather volunteers because they simply don't need to. 1798, 99, there might have been a bit more of a sense, an attempt to get men to volunteer, but once conscription's fully established, they don't. What they do is try to encourage conscripts to actually turn up. Um, Especially in the early years, a large proportion of conscripts simply don't bother. So you do get kind of equivalents to recruitment parties trying to G men up and say, come on, you want to be in the army, but they're doing it for conscripts, not for volunteers.
Okay, I love this talk because I've looked at a lot of similar themes with the British Army, so it's interesting to see that this other aspect of it from the French perspective. You touched on the importance of literacy. I think particularly when it comes to promotion and maybe some of the more senior NCO roles. Was there anything in the French Army that helped develop or promote literacy within the regiments? Because towards the latter part of the Napoleonic Wars, there was actually a senior NCO role in a lot of British regiments called the schoolmaster sergeant.
Mhm. Yeah, there are regimental schools in the French army where men can learn to read and write, and they are developed. So Coignet, for example, famous memorialist, I suppose, for the Napoleonic Wars, who writes his service down. He's taught to write in the army, um, but there's no systematic education. Not every soldier will receive that education, but there are, regimental schools. Um, the there's more likely to be an unofficial kind of dynamic going on between soldiers, though, where men will teach their comrades to read and write. Often they'll read and write their letters for them, so they'll write home to the person, they'll read out the responses, but they might teach them to read and write through that. So there is this process where men are learning literacy, but it's not fully systematic. Um, it's kind of at the whim of the regimental colonel as to how much he puts into it, and also once they're on campaign, there's probably less time for things like learning to read.
Okay, I'm kind of doing this sequentially, so we'll get to um, Chris's question as we hit the casualties. I'm wondering, in England, we had the early advent of industrialization from agricultural practices, enclosures of commons, and I think it drove a lot of people into poverty and created more fertile ground for recruiting. Was there similar in France, or was France, because of the Revolutionary Wars, kind of behind some of these trends?
Certainly, the enclosure changes and industrialization aren't happening as much in France. Industrialization definitely less. Urbanization isn't going on as fast in France. Um, there's With the revolution, 10% of French land gets sold off. The church land is sold off, often to people with money, but there are more um, peasants, I suppose we can call them, kind of ordinary people of the countryside who have a plot of land. So there's less of a kind of push factor through things like enclosure. There's less poverty in that way. Um, but there is still poverty that's pushing people into the army and kind of agreeing with conscription because they're in poverty. There are a couple of bad harvest failures during the Empire, and the economic blockade of Britain blockading France's ports. Even though Napoleon puts this continental system in place to try to make European countries captive markets for France, it really hurts French industry. And these can be very traditional industries as well as what we think of as kind of industrialized. Um, so there is quite a bad economic downturn in France, especially between 1810 and 12. And this pushes a lot of people into poverty who then want to be conscripted. And we actually get men writing to prefects demanding to be conscripted, saying, I don't have a job, I don't have any money. You've said I'm going to be conscripted in 3 months, so no one will employ me. So can you just take me now? And the prefect said, no, you've got to wait. But we do have poverty pushing men into the army as well. But of course, in France, you could become a replacement. So if you're under the age of 30, you can offer yourself as a replacement conscript, and that is a very valuable commodity. People will pay thousands of francs, a couple of years' wages, cash in hand, for you to take their place in the army. So a lot of men, rather than volunteering or demanding to be conscripted, if they were eligible to be a replacement, you had to have a certain height and you had to have a kind of clean disciplinary record and you had to be of a certain age. So there are restrictions to it. But if you could become a replacement, you would go up to the first conscription round and just say, okay, who wants to buy me? Someone's going to pay me a lot of money for this.
All right, you anticipated my next question, so interesting. Uh, More of an aside, the British drill manual of the period also called for three ranks, but I think they dispensed with that because it wasn't practical, and then also by forming two ranks, then that gave them more breadth across the battlefield, and all the muskets can come into play. I find the height dynamic bizarre, with the tallest in the first rank, because that effectively blocks the two ranks behind, and then having, as a reenactor, tried firing in three ranks. The other critical element is to have everyone close up. So the third most rank, the muzzle of their musket projects ahead of the first rank is critical. Otherwise, you're not only deafening, but fragging everyone in the front rank with sparks and debris coming out of the muzzle of the musket. So, uh, finally, Chris, I'll get to your question. He asks, how were casualties evacuated from the battlefield? Was there a systematic approach to Cassavac?
So theoretically, they shouldn't have been evacuated while the battle is ongoing. But in practice, what really happens is that men will take their comrades to the rear. So as their formation's going forward, you're meant to leave your wounded and just carry on. But men would obviously, grab their mate, take them back. And sometimes you get, 4 or 6 men helping a single casualty going back. It was a real drain on manpower for an attack. Um, but they take them back basically to the start line. And just behind there should be the ambulances. Now, it depends on how well organized the corps is and how well organized the units are as to how many ambulances they have. But these will be kind of sprung vehicles that men can be put on and taken from there to, I suppose we call it a clearing station in 20th century terminology, but where the army doctors were essentially. Um, so the French had this system of evacuation, but you weren't meant to evacuate them during the action. You were simply meant to leave them, and they were meant to somehow be collected later or make their way back. Uh, but people are very practical about this. Marshal Ney, writing his instructions to his corps in 1804, 1805, he says, official regulations are that you are not allowed to help the wounded back, but we know you're going to do it anyway. So only one man is allowed to help a lightly wounded comrade, and only 2 men allowed to help someone missing a limb and unable to walk. So, even in his kind of regulations to his corps, he is acknowledging that they are going to break the rules and help men back anyway. But there's no systematic moving from kind of action zone back to the ambulances. But the ambulances that exist, they do have this way of they take them back to where the doctors are. their kind of field hospitals are set up, and from there, once they've been treated, they will be evacuated to the nearest kind of base hospital, I suppose, again using 20th century terminology, which will probably be in a town or city nearby where there's more space, a bit more comfort.
So, did the drummers play a role at all in helping to clear casualties from the battlefield? Like in the British Army, in theory, that was one of their roles as the battle commenced.
Yeah, the bandsmen of the British Army were meant to be the stretcher bearers, weren't they? But the drummers certainly didn't because they had a battlefield role in the French army and I suppose the British as well. The regimental bands may have been used in the French army, but I've not come across that. Um, but it is meant to just be, after the battle is won, then you come back and get your wounded and take them to the rear.
Yeah, I've read accounts, Battle of Waterloo, and they're talking like a full day later, they were still
Yeah,
retrieving wounded men from the field that were in
yeah,
very dire shape. And then, as I understand it, the French were actually quite progressive, right? Their battlefield care, like right from the ambulances with springs, to
mhm.
protect the wounded soldiers that were gathered up to, I think even their first treatments. Didn't the British Army try to replicate some of their efforts around triage and the initial treating of wounded?
Yeah. The French army doctors were, I think, better trained generally, but they also didn't go to amputation as kind of the go-to treatment for things. In the British Army, something gets shattered, amputation's 80% of the time the solution. The French doctors would try to patch men up a lot more, maybe recognizing that amputation has such an impact on the individual. Um, they were a bit more forward thinking generally. Larrey, who's Napoleon's Surgeon General, is a very humane man in many ways and really tries to look after the wounded. But as with all armies, they are hamstrung by a lack of resources, a lack of doctors, orderlies, a lack of nursing. So, the doctors will do their thing, but there's no aftercare, or not as much aftercare. Um, and so we do find, wounded men dying en masse in hospitals, having been treated because there's not the resources to look after them afterwards. Because fever breaks out in hospitals as well. Um, but French treatment, I think, was generally better on the battlefield than the British, although I have to say that the medical side of it isn't my expertise.
No, myself either, but if the French had doctors, that's a step above right there, where a surgeon in the British Army didn't necessarily mean a high degree of medical training. So,
Mhm.
all right. Chris, thank you for your answer. He felt it was very informative. I don't see any other questions there, so I think we'll wrap this up. So, Graham, on behalf of the History Symposium, our audience, thanks so much for sharing your knowledge and research with us. It's really appreciated. And to all our audience, thank you for joining us here on a Saturday afternoon. Really appreciate your participation and yeah, just watching a bunch of stuff coming in, but it's generally thank yous and expressions of appreciation. So I'm going to stop the live stream, but Graham, if you can hang with me for a moment, then we'll wrap up with just you and I.